Take two, because not sure what happened to the first recording of this. Okay, so today I want to talk a little bit about the Viltrox 23mm f1.4 for the Fuji X mount system. So this lens is an alternative to the Fuji 23mm f1.4 that was released like 1,000 years ago. It is also a 1.4 lens, and it is very old, and it is very expensive. So I wanted to pick up this lens to try to compare and contrast the two, even though I don't even own that lens, but I wanted to just see how this lens stacked up for me. Simply is not good. And just to see how good or bad it was. At $330, who knows, you know, that's not cheap by any means, but compared to the Fuji lenses themselves, that's very, very inexpensive. So I wanted to buy this lens mostly just to have an autofocus lens that I could use for just photography, running around and making quick videos, to just see how it stacked up compared to some native Fuji lenses that I've used in the past. This lens is 23mm, $329-ish on Amazon or wherever you buy it, B&H, whatever. So far, after using it for a little while, it has been really, really solid. Build-wise, it is sturdy. It's made out of metal. It's not plastic. It's really heavy, really well constructed. I own the version 2. I'm pretty certain the only difference between the version 1 and the version 2 are cosmetic. The version 1 looked a little generic, and this one doesn't look professional by any means, but it looks a lot better and definitely could pass for a more professional looking lens, if that makes sense.
It's hard to be inspired when it's this ugly.
But generally it looks great, it's built great. I feel like I could drop it quite a few times and it would probably be fine. Don't test it. If you want to, that's fine. I'm not going to. Other than that, you know, build quality, generally pretty solid. The focus ring, it seems to have a fairly long focus throw actually. So say you're doing video production and you want to use manual focus and be really precise, a longer focus throw is typically better. Build-wise, it's really, really solid. The next reason that I wanted to pick this lens up was for, like I said, autofocus. The autofocus seems to be very, very snappy, and the X-T4, which is what's filming this right now, the X-T4 itself is really solid in terms of autofocus generally. So it seems like this lens complements that already fast autofocus very nicely, and is just really strong generally. I've played with it at a few different settings, you know, changing sensitivity and speed within the camera, and I think this is at like sort of a middle ground, because sometimes it can get way too snappy and way too sensitive to where it becomes distracting. And that's always kind of a balance that you have to fine tune over time, especially depending on what you're shooting. But again, this lens has been really solid overall with autofocus, and I've been actually pleasantly surprised. If we can just like look at it here, like, I mean, it seems fairly solid to me. I have no real complaints about autofocus, especially because it's something that I don't even use that often, other than for filming stuff like this or doing photography, just walking around doing street photography. So I've been pleasantly surprised with the autofocus. I thought it was gonna be a lot slower. So yeah, autofocus generally very solid from this lens. I could see it not being nearly as fast using it on an older version of the camera, just because say you're using an X-T1 or something that has an older autofocus system, it's probably not gonna perform nearly as well. But generally with this X-T4, and I think it's just generally really good, and it's gonna be on par with any Fuji native lens. So autofocus, thumbs up for me. In terms of image quality, I've been actually very, very surprised with this lens. And I've been surprised for two reasons specifically. The first reason is the sharpness. It is super, super sharp. I had to shut the internal sharpness on the camera completely off. It's at -4, which is the lowest it can possibly go, just because it was a little too sharp and it was producing a like video-y look that you'd get from like a camcorder. So I had to turn that all the way down. But if you're looking at it from a photography perspective, you want to kind of do all that stuff in post a lot of times versus doing it internally and sort of being stuck. So sharpness for photography is good. It is super, super sharp. And I think just for that, for the price point, and for the money, you know, you can't beat the fact that it's a really sharp lens that resolves a lot of detail. I think that's definitely a pro. And the second thing that I wanted to mention is just the weird chromatic aberrations that you get a lot of times with this lens. It can be really pronounced when there's harsh lighting, something dark on a really bright background, or whatever, just your normal ways that chromatic aberration presents itself. So that is very apparent with this lens. Some people don't mind chromatic aberration that much, and some people actually kind of like it, as it's sort of a vintage characteristic that a lot of vintage lenses have. I don't personally mind it so much because, again, for $330 you can kind of only expect so much out of a lens. So chromatic aberration definitely exists with this lens, and it's something that you probably would want to consider. I haven't ever noticed a ton of chromatic aberration on any Fuji native lenses, so that's certainly something that is exclusive to this lens. And I know just most recently with the 16-55, it was pretty much non-existent. I don't think I ever noticed any chromatic aberration, so that is certainly something to note. Some people actually like the aberrated look sometimes, like I said, because it gives it that sort of vintage characteristic, but I personally don't love it or hate it, so I'm kind of indifferent about it. But generally, image quality is really strong. It's sharp. I mean, renders color nicely. It renders the image nicely, and it's a great sort of field of view. And that kind of brings me to my final point, whereas it is a just great all-around autofocus lens. So it kind of equates to that 35mm field of view, which is known for being sort of a good middle ground, not too wide, but also not too narrow of a focal length. The 1.4 aperture, and just the really solid image quality and autofocus speed that you get from a lens like this one. So it's definitely a lens that I'm going to keep, and it's definitely a lens that I can very easily recommend if you're looking for a sort of budget option, because again, the Fuji lenses are very expensive and they're very well made, but they're really not cheap at all. So those are kind of my thoughts on the 23mm Viltrox f1.4. Let me know what you think down below. Do you use this lens? Do you own it? Have you tried it? Do you want to try it? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.
Hey guys,